Good afternoon. Welcome. And we're just delighted to present David Teece in a program this afternoon that I think you will find insightful, provocative, and hopefully one that leads you to think about competitiveness on the national as well as firm level in a different way, as well as education. But first I'd like to tell you a bit about David. He's a native New Zealander, so he's a Kiwi at heart, correct? And he is the Teece Professor in Global Business and the Director of the Institute for Business Innovation at the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's the founder and chairman of Berkeley Research Group, LLC. I will mention that that the Berkeley Research Group, LLC, was founded 3 years ago. It was a startup 3 years ago. Currently, they have, you want to think about a fast startup, they have 530 people employed, and there are 200 million revenue base. So he knows a bit about what he's going to be talking about. He's also taken 2 companies public. One is currently on NASDAQ, and the other is on the New York Stock Exchange. But some more about Professor Teece. He's known in academia for creating the concept of dynamic capabilities, an idea he began to develop while researching for his PhD in economics at the University of Pennsylvania in 1975. Professor Teece's most recent publication on the topic is Dynamic Capabilities and Strategic Management, Organizing for Innovation and Growth, and it's published by Oxford University Press. Other publications include 2 volumes of published papers by Edward Elgar in London in Economists of the 20th Century, titled Economic Performance and the Theory of the Firm and Strategy, Technology, and Public Policy. In addition, he is also the co-author of over 200 books and articles on topics in innovation strategy, intellectual property, and antitrust policy, which further contributes to his extensive experience in litigation and regulatory issues. Outside of academia, David Teece has served several times as an expert witness in numerous courts, administrative bodies, and tribunals in the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as in Europe, where he's testified on various economic issues in business such as industrial organization, antitrust, and competition policy, negotiation strategy, and complex damages. Other accolades include 4 honorary doctorates, the Accenture list of the top 50 living business intellectuals, the 2002 Vipuri International Prize in Strategic Technology Management and Business Economics, and the 2003 Strategic Management Journal Best Paper Award. His most notable achievement is the lead author of the most cited paper in Economics and Business, 1995 to 2005, and is ranked number 10 in citations worldwide by the same source for the same time period. The other thing I'd like to tell you about David Teece is that I spent a little time with David and Lee and Austin, their son, at dinner last night. And the two characteristics I came away with was sharing and caring. He's not opposed to sharing dinner and wine with his wife, single glass, single plate. And the caring part comes when I learned that he never neglects to respond to his children whenever they text or email him, no matter where and what he's doing. So I'd like to introduce David Teece.
Thank you, Sarah. That was way too generous an introduction, and as you go through my background, it sounds like I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be, and that's sort of partly true. And it comes together in the following sense. Yes, I decided to do a PhD in economics, and I did so at the Wharton School many years ago. But at the same time, I was interested in the real world, fascinated by businesses, fascinated by questions of competitive advantage. You know, how do nations get to be great? How do they lose their competitive advantage? How do firms get to be great? what causes them to go down the tubes. And I studied economics hoping I'd find the answers. I found some of them, but I decided I'm just going to keep going until I got better answers and I could get in the textbooks. And I was constantly frustrated by, reading the textbooks and then talking to people in industry, and picking up books like this one here, The Lean Startup, for instance, which is the hottest thing in Silicon Valley. Everyone in San Francisco, everyone at Cal Berkeley and Stanford, they're all reading this and spouting it back. There is the connection between what's in the economics textbook and what's in the Lean Startup is not apparent. And so what I'd like to do today is to actually try and make some of these connections for you, to tell you that what's in the textbook is not all wrong, nor is it all right, and also that what's in the Lean Startup and other sort of commonplace adages about how do you build competitive advantage and how do you, create new companies is often superficial, and there's ways to talk about it that's more fundamental that I think would enable us to learn more from each other and learn more in the process of doing startups. So I've given myself a really big task, and behind it all is these even two bigger questions. I would say arguably the two biggest questions that you could ask in economics and business. On the one hand, one, what determines the competitive advantage of nations? And even though it's in my title, I'm not really going to spend more than one slide on that. And then two, what determines the competitive advantage of firms? How do firms get to differentiate and earn, as the economist term, supernormal profits? How do you get to be better than average? The big fundamental questions, and if I advise you as you go on through studies, always focus on the big questions. There's a great tendency to drop down and ask little uninteresting questions. If you stay focused on the big questions, it's a more interesting journey, and it enables you to hold together your inquiry and attention. So let me just sort of begin by outlining a few really big trends, what I call mega trends that have happened in the economy. We're all aware of them, but we very rarely think through the implications of them. First of all, decreased cost and increased speed of information flow. That means everybody knows everything that's knowable pretty quickly these days. And on the right there, dispersion in the sources of innovation. It used to be we'd think that most of the innovation came from the United States. By the way, that was never true. You take the chemical and the drug industry, the Germans and the Swiss, always big contributors, and the British, very big contributors. But it's now the case that the sources of innovation are widely distributed, not just between the traditional European and American sources, but in Asia as well. On the bottom right there, natural time and distance protections eroded. You could be a little bit sleepy in the past because competition would take its time to creep up on you. Now competition's on you all the time. And at the same time, and this is a benefit in the bottom left, increasing ease of organizing and accessing complementary assets. So you can also get stuff off the shelf in ways you couldn't. The world's been unbundled for you. So running a business today in this environment is completely different from running a business in the world of Alfred Chandler, where you had very large vertically integrated firms that did most of everything in-house, be it the old Henry Ford, be it the old DuPont, be it the old AT&T. The integrated world, to some extent, has gone away. The real trick today is to figure out what bits do you need to do in-house and what bits do you need to outsource. And part of my story is going to be that's not just framed the way economists tend to frame it around contractual issues. One also has to begin to talk about something that I'm going to call capabilities. So let's just sort of put it in perspective. In this world of decreased cost in information and faster information flow, where everybody knows everybody, where you can access components from everybody else, that's the expansion of the intermediate product markets. You can run a virtual petroleum refinery today. You just go buy the intermediate products from whoever and blend it into a product. Couldn't do that 20, 30 years ago. Easier access to complementary assets. Distributors will take your stuff. Erosion of the traditional basis of competition. Then you're down to two things there that sort of define what is your basis of heterogeneity today, and it's down to intangible assets and the way you orchestrate them. So in this world, and I'm sorry that the colors don't come out there very well, but in this world that we have today, at the end of the day, the things that you can own that create differentiation, uniqueness, are all down to things you can't buy. It's a great paradox of economics. Economists have done such a good job of creating markets for everything that if everyone can access and buy in those same markets, how the heck do you build competitive advantage? How do you look different from everybody else? It's by building intangible assets, because there's no market for them. There may be some kind of little corners of markets for patents, but in general, trade, not just intellectual property, but know-how, knowledge, and so forth, at least proprietary knowledge, doesn't trade. And if you can orchestrate all that stuff, then you have a chance of making value, creating value. It's a very different story from what the basic economics textbooks give you, because the basic economics textbooks always begins with a world of perfect competition, and then maybe it'll move on to oligopoly, and maybe it'll talk about monopoly. But behind it all, there's a story that everyone's got access to the same technology. Well, that's rubbish. And because it's rubbish, you don't get a lot of insights, but still knowing the extreme forms, knowing what a monopoly looks like is valuable, and knowing what perfect competition looks like is valuable, but you're going to have to build the bridges yourself to the real world to understand how to work between those two extremes. Now, I always like to give my conclusions up front. And there's a simple coherence to this. Putting aside institutional questions, which of course is a big plus, and big assumption, at the end of the day, the wealth of nations depends on our ability to generate and use, with emphasis on use, modern technology. I mean, why did Soviet Union collapse? Well, it's fundamentally because we out-innovated them. Whatever other story out there, it doesn't matter. We out-innovated them. They couldn't innovate because they didn't have a system for generating new technologies, except for in the defense sector. And even there, they had to steal most of what they got from us. But the fact is, capitalism, the fundamental benefit of capitalism is innovation, which, by the way, is not what the basic twin theorems of economics, actually the twin theorems of economics will tell you that one of the great things you'll learn in graduate school, that under certain conditions, socialism and capitalism are equivalent, and that they can both bring about a rational allocation of resources. But the reality is that the difference between capitalism and socialism, in one system we know how to innovate, and the other you can't. And it's not just a story about incentives. My focus today is not going to be at the nation-state level, but it's going to be at the level of the firm. Competitive advantage today is built and defended not in product markets, but upstream in markets for know-how and other intangibles. It's going to be a story about capabilities, a word that doesn't even exist in the economics textbook, but it's a word that you all use. All of you here in this room would talk about whether somebody is capable or whether an organization is capable. It's a natural way of thinking about things, but no one's put any structure behind that notion of what a capability is. So a good question we have down here at the table is, can Apple continue beyond Steve Jobs? Did it depend on one guy, or did the essence of Steve Jobs get translated into organizational something or other? Well, the something or other is capabilities. Why don't we understand that better? Well, partly because we haven't bothered to study it. And part of my research agenda is to start studying those things in a systematic way and understand what it is about routines, about culture, about values inside organizations that can answer those very basic questions. You've got the organizational behavior people that spend all day talking about culture and values, but they never link it up to the economics, which is, well, how can you translate that into competitive advantage? So in a great liberal arts college like this, you have a chance to, in both curriculum and in faculty research, to begin to deal with that. And that's what I call the dynamic capabilities perspective. And just to show you that we're not talking completely hot air, I always like to go to an executive or two. And here you got Sam Palmisano, who no longer the CEO of IBM, saying, innovation is about much more than new products. I mean, most of us tend to think that's what innovation is about. No, it's also about reinventing business processes and building entirely new markets. that meet untapped customer needs. He might have said it's also about building entirely new business models, and I know some of you in your entrepreneurship classes have been thinking along those lines. And even the discredited Alan Greenspan has enough IQ to say, hey, listen, we really need to understand the macroeconomy. We have to begin developing a framework capable of analyzing the growth of an economy increasingly dominated by conceptual products. What the heck is a conceptual product? Well, I think he's really talking about intangible assets in the service economy. You know, we're not about making nuts and bolts anymore. We're a service economy, and the essence of prosperity depends on creating, protecting, and managing intangible assets. And by the way, I have a book in 2000 called Managing Intellectual Capital, and I chose that title because I think that's the way to think about it today. The game is about managing intellectual capital. So here are the classes of intangibles: technological know-how, IP, business process know-how, customer relations, reputations, capabilities. These are the things that matter. These are the things that matter because you can't go into Walmart and buy a reputation, or you can't go to IBM and buy a capability. They might claim that they can sell you a capability, but the truth of the matter is they might be able to help you create a capability. They can't. So none of these things are, there's any supply. So you have to go build it yourself. And that's what great companies do. Why have knowledge assets and capabilities become more important? Well, the answer, of course, is that they've always been at the heart of product and process innovation. But as I said, they're just hard to build and, most importantly, difficult to imitate. And inherently, they're not easy to access. And as a result of that, they have what I think of as strategic value. So you can rely to some extent on the IP system to protect you, but not enough. I mean, look at the great battle going on right now between Samsung and Apple. You know, it's a fight around the future of not just mobile telephony, but many other aspects of digital electronics markets. And there are wars, there are IP wars at the edges, because that's one of the few ways that each party can try and get leverage over the other. But it's really a war about capabilities that looks, reading from the newspaper, like it's a war about intellectual property. But it's a much bigger war of which we just see the tip of the iceberg. Why is it that intangible assets don't function or you can't buy and sell them? And the answer is property rights are often poorly defined. Think about a patent. Patent is never clearly defined. You know, a piece of real property. If you go buy a house or buy a piece of land, you know where the boundary line is. You go get a patent, you don't know where the boundary line really is. It's what I call the fuzzy boundary problem. And you've got to take it to court to have a judge usually tell you where the boundary line is. And then another court may tell you it's actually somewhere else. So in this world of unclear property rights, every economist will tell you if property rights aren't crisp, transactions won't happen. And by the way, this is how the courts make it more difficult for themselves. The antitrust guys think they'll jump in the middle of an intellectual property case, and they muddy the waters even more and decrease the chance of any transaction and increase the chance of further litigation. So because the competition policy guys never think for more than 5 minutes about the indirect implications of what they're up to and how the market for intellectual property works, they constantly try to end up doing bad by trying to do good. So these complications create imperfections which impair imitation but potentially support quasi-rent generation. So what is competitive advantage? I define competitive advantage as the ability of a firm to make supernormal profits longer run. By doing that, you'll also recognize that there's almost nobody who has competitive advantage. I mean, if you have competitive advantage, it's usually only for a short period of time. You know, IBM had it for a while, Xerox had it for a while, General Motors had it for a while. No one seems to have it for more than about 10 to 15 years. So that tells you it's a slippery thing, difficult to build, and it's a slippery thing to hold on to. But it's nevertheless what everybody gets up in the morning trying to figure out how to do that's in a company, and it's what every stock analyst tries to do every day, is to try and figure out who is going to have competitive advantage. So understanding competitive advantage is what animates everything from investment to managerial decisions to the wealth of nations. If you end up, you cannot, as Alfred Chandler told us, you can't have a wealthy country if it's got firms that aren't making any money. You know that. You didn't need Alfred Chandler to tell you that. So these are big, deep questions, and we need to try and explore the foundations a little better. First of all, my framework, so I'm now going to launch into a little bit of my thinking about this over 20 years. And so the first thing is I throw the concept of industry out the window. I don't know what an industry is. I don't think I ever did. It's some concoction of government statisticians. You know, they define tobacco industries, auto industries, this industry, that industry. But it's not economically meaningful, never has been. But the notion of an ecosystem is. And this sort of brings into play the notion that firms compete not just against other firms in the industry, but they may compete with firms in different industries, as Microsoft is discovering now with competition coming in from Google. It looks like a company in the search industry, but no, it's in fact crossing the line and competing with Microsoft. But the supporting institutions are part of that infrastructure, and Apple has created its own little ecosystem. So you can also have bigger ecosystems, and inside it you can have smaller ecosystems. So you can bring economics closer to evolutionary biology by bringing some evolutionary notions into economics. And I think I would suggest that as a way to begin thinking about a lot of issues. And so this is more the environment in which you understand how firms compete. You know, Michael Porter at Harvard is famous for creating courses which are still taught at Harvard called industry analysis. Obviously, I don't think very much of that from what I've said already. I don't think industry analysis is particularly meaningful. But if you did ecosystem analysis, and this suits very well a liberal arts school like this, there's a broader set of institutions, there's the media, there's universities, there's regulatory bodies, standard setting body. All of this is part of the environment of business, as we well know, but it also has to be part of the analytical apparatus. So that's one aspect of the environment. As I've also hinted at, we need a whole concept, a different concept of what a firm is. Firms and foremost are organizations. And I was going to bring you, maybe it's the next slide. I'll go on. This is what I taught my students in economics a firm was, ashamedly so. This is a so-called production function. I taught microeconomics to graduate students at Stanford for 3 or 4 years, and I used to dish this stuff out, and I couldn't understand why they couldn't get excited about my treatment of the theory of the firm. And of course, they knew more than I did. Well, they were actually older than I was, so it's not surprising. But this is not a firm. This sort of assumes a fixed relationship between inputs and outputs. And in Silicon Valley, there is no such fixed relationships. There may be certain corners of the economy where you can define a production function, but it's not a particularly meaningful way to capture organizations unless you also introduce the notion that you can typically be off of the production function because you're not organized properly internally. So I want to sort of throw away a lot of the apparatus associated with the textbook caricature of the firm. It's a good place to start, but it's not the place to finish, because the textbook view assumes common technologies, homogeneous firms, prices that are known, and of course, you're familiar with all of this, and indeed there's been a lot of modifications. We've gotten away from, people have now explored the special cases, but in my view, it's not enough. It's not really a good enough point to keep working on, because managers and entrepreneurs need to recognize that, first of all, you know, firms don't fall like manna out of heaven, they get built. And the optimization tools of economics sort of already assume a firm is built, but most of you here are thinking about, you know, entrepreneurial startups. You can't assume something's built before you build it. So at least you can say that most of the building part is not something that is captured by the textbooks. So here's a new way to begin thinking about it, and this brings me to the lean startup story. And I will show that this sort of ties into some basic ideas. I mean, in today's world of high uncertainty, when you start a company, you know, it's not even clear, and this may offend some people, that you need a business plan, or if you have a business plan, you got to realize that may be good for only about 3 nanoseconds. The Berkeley Research Group, the company that Sarah mentioned I started, we built it to 550 people. Did I have a business plan? Yeah, I wrote something down. Didn't write it down for our own purposes, but someone on the outside, a capital provider, you know, they want to know something about what you're doing. Sure, I'll write something down. I made it very general and very vague. But the truth of the matter is that in world of high uncertainty, you're making a leap in the dark. And the job is to learn about customers and marketplace needs. So let me just read through what Eric Ries and the Lean Startup. This is a computer scientist talking economics, so it's not all that elegant. The way forward is to learn to see every startup in any industry as a grand experiment. The question is not, can this product be built? Look, in the modern economy, almost any product that can be imagined can be built. That ties in with my, you know, mega trends. The more pertinent question is, should this product be built? Can we build a sustainable business around this set of products and services? To answer those questions, we need a method for systematically breaking down a business plan into its component parts and testing each part empirically. How do you test each part empirically? It's not by going to some grand database in the sky, it's by actually doing stuff. So Tom Peters, who wrote the most famous business book ever in terms of publications, you know, In Search of Excellence, he had a chapter called A Bias for Action. Now, why would you have a bias for action? You know, most of the time we teach students how to not do stupid stuff, how to avoid biases. But if you're trying to learn, you don't want to do analysis paralysis. So if you have a bias for action, you just move. If in doubt, do. You start and you learn, and you know, maybe you're going down a blind alley. You learn sooner than later. And of course, this sort of view of the world works well in software. And remember, Eric Ries is a computer scientist. If you're Boeing, it doesn't work quite so well. If you're going to bet the company every time you build a new airplane like the Dreamliner, you're not going to charge off willy-nilly and build something like the Dreamliner without doing a lot of planning and a lot of hard thinking and a lot of, you know, computer simulation. So you know, the problem with a book like this, and the problem with the fact that academic research is way over here in left field and practice is way over in right field, you end up with guys saying things like this, that if you're in the wrong industry and you read that and you follow that, you'll make a real stupid mistake. And so social science research needs to get down to business and actually try and resolve some of those problems. And the way I've chosen to do this is to try and put some meat, some content, as modest as it is, behind this concept of capabilities. And I distinguish between 2 types of capabilities. This seems all so simple, but I think you'll find it quite pragmatic and useful. There are ordinary capabilities that are around operations, in particular, and governance. And they're the kind of capabilities that someone can teach you, that you can go to school and learn. You're not going to learn anything other than ordinary stuff in school about management. I promise you that, you know, having been in at least 2 major business schools for quite some time. But ordinary capabilities are sort of necessary in order to be successful, but they're not sufficient. Dynamic capabilities are about how do you figure out the next big thing? How do you figure out how to orchestrate all of these intangible assets? How do you figure out when to pivot? Which is, how do you figure out a strategy that makes sense given the environment that you're in? I'm obviously summarizing something that I've written a lot more on than that, but ordinary things in the main can be taught. Doesn't mean to say everyone can do ordinary things. There's a nice study out there in the Academy of Management that shows that firms in Brazil and India, stuff that we consider ordinary, they don't do very well. And if you look at U.S. marketplace and firms in U.S. industries, and excuse me for using the word industry, you'll find some firms are very good and some are not. That there's enormous heterogeneity inside so-called industries. And so there are firms that are not good at doing ordinary things, and I'm not focused on those. What I'm focused on, though, is if you've got strong ordinary capabilities, that will enable you to maybe earn a living. You'll get a competitive rate of return. But who wants to wake up and go to work to get a competitive rate of return? Okay, it's a job, so maybe I shouldn't trivialize it. But it's hard work, and at the end of the day, you end up not making significant money. You're going from hand to mouth. You're not generating any surplus to invest for the real long term. So dynamic capabilities are where the game is at. And I've tried to put some meat onto this concept. There's ordinary. How do you get from ordinary to dynamic? Just to give a little bit of a sense of where this comes from. I don't know if any of you have read the book by Bob Lutz called Car Guys. It's a fun book. Bob Lutz is a graduate of the Haas School. But look what he says. It's very much along the lines of what I've been saying. He says, the operations portion of the auto business has been thoroughly optimized for many decades. Now, of course, the Chinese are just learning this part. They're now just figured out how to optimize. They can make good cars. So there's a little bit of hyperbole in what Lutz is saying. But it's true. If you look at Volkswagen, General Motors, Ford, they all know how to, get a car put together. And to do so in a reasonably cost-efficient way. But what's the hard part of the business? The hard part of the car business, it requires little in the way of, here's what he's saying here. He says, people think of that as a hard part. You ask an engineer whether that's hard, an engineer will tell you, yes, it is. But he says, the hard part of the industry requires little in the way of creativity, of vision, or imagination. Almost all car companies do this well. And there is little or no competitive advantage to be gained by trying even harder. So if you get another nickel out of the cost of your fuel injection system, so what? Someone else is going to figure it out too. So you're going down a road where you're never going to get ahead. It's a job of, you're chasing your tail basically and never building competitive advantage, but you have to do it to stay in the game. But what makes a difference? Where the real work of making a car company successful suddenly turns complex, and where the winners are separated from the losers is in the long cycle product development process, where short day-to-day metrics and the tabulation of results are meaningless. It's all about developing new products and new product concepts. I mean, that's what got Chrysler back, was inventing the minivan, creating new categories and being first in that game. So it's all about innovation in the way you run the business. It's not about innovation in operations, even though you have to innovate in operations because everybody else is. But to differentiate globally, you got to develop capabilities beyond that. And behind it all is the importance of learning. And I mentioned that before, and so I won't spend any more time on it, other than to sort of indicate this. It's about validated learning, and here, it comes back to science. So that think of every time you do something in a startup environment as being a hypothesis. My hypothesis, don't say I'm going to do this, this is the way to do it. Say, my hypothesis is that the customer wants X, and if I develop Y and present the value proposition is the following. But it's just a hypothesis, and you're monitoring very carefully to see every step of the way whether your hypothesis is correct. And if it's not correct, you better then figure out how to do something different. So, as I point out, these guys are not sitting around setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. That's not the stuff that animates managerial decisions. Except in a very narrow set of technical questions. Rather, in real life, a lot is happening simultaneously, acquiring new customers, serving existing ones, raising capital, building capabilities, trying to improve the product, improving operations, deciding if and when to pivot. That's more what management is about. So here's the new word in Silicon Valley is pivot. So you all got to know what this word is if you're going to hang out in the bars in San Francisco As I would say, ordinary capabilities are what Eric Ries calls tuning the engine. Dynamic capabilities often involve a change in strategy or in business model. And your ability to do that quickly and accurately and sensibly is the pivot. It's starting to sound like a ballet, and in part it is. So this is kind of my key statement of what dynamic capabilities is: the ability of an organization and its management to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competences to address rapidly changing environments. Quite a mouthful, but that's closer to the description, not telling you necessarily how to do it, of what's necessary. And that capability, if you have that capability, you have a chance of building long-term competitive advantage. And just to let you know that this is not sort of some idea I cooked up yesterday, I did this with a couple of my graduate students, actually back in '97, and the Google sites to this paper are now over 15,000, and it is the most, if you look at economics and business together over the last 15 years, it's the most cited paper, period, in the top 100 journals. So it's out there, and I'll be the first one to say it's out there because people are intrigued by it. But it's also, you know, it needs more than just being, you need to have more than just being intrigued by it. You have to actually then figure out how to apply it, how to test it, and that's where the literature is moving. So let me sort of give you some simple ways to think about this. The old approach, you know, we thought about, well, how much mass did you have? You know, you competed by having a lot of this and a lot of that. And the military, you know, most ideas in strategy, by the way, come from the military. We've concocted very little in business strategy that's informed the military, but the military's concocted a lot that's informed business strategy, even though I want to point out the two very different games. You know, you can't burn down your competitors' factories and things like that in business, but you have to think strategically in business. And the old way of doing things was the way the Russians did it, which was to count how much stuff they had. But the reason we won the Cold War is we didn't have as much stuff as they did, but we figured out how to make it work together and work well together. And let's hope with sequestration that we can continue to maintain that. And we have Steve Jobs at Apple saying, you know, it's not about routines. And I'm going to move on here to see what Tim Cook says. Apple remains ahead of its rivals in the ability to innovate and create magic, despite tougher competition in key sectors like smartphone and tablets. Apple still has strong growth opportunities because of its ability to work simultaneously on hardware, software, and services. Apple has the ability to innovate in all three of these spheres and create magic. So, competitive advantage is all about magic. But we need to know what's behind magic, and you know, this is what dynamic capabilities try to explain. What he does say that agrees with what I told you is it isn't something you can just write a check for. So the magic of Apple is not something you can buy. And remember my starting point here, you only build competitive advantage when you're building around things that other people can't access. So if you can't buy it, you have to build it. And you need guys like Steve Jobs and Tim Cook behind them to actually figure out how to build great companies, how to make them highly innovative, to figure out what the next big thing is and then deliver on it. So that's what it takes to get ahead of the game. I heard with pleasure a few minutes ago before lunch that you're having General McChrystal visit here in a couple of weeks. And General McChrystal was in charge of Special Forces and then I think in charge of the Army in Afghanistan. And I was reading through Foreign Affairs recently, and it's really nice when you're reading someone in a completely different area and it resonates with what I've been trying to say to my students for a long time. And he says, winning in business is like, well, this is me actually, winning in business is like winning a war against insurgents. The enemy, according to McChrystal, was scattered, committed, and well-armed. How do you win? Well, you don't win just by doing more and more raids. He says, in fact, you can trick yourself to think you're winning. If you go out there and you do another raid and you're a successful raid and another successful raid, you're doing a head count of raids, a bit like Vietnam. You think you're winning, but you're not, because it's a much bigger game that involves developing a counterinsurgency strategy. You got to find information, pull it together, and empower its use. The old model, you push information up to the top. The guys at the top make a decision on whether you're going to do a raid. You can't do many raids if they've all got to be pushed to the top. So the way we turned the tide in Afghanistan and Iraq was by getting information out, distributed to a lot more people, and decentralizing decisions. Same way that we do it in Silicon Valley. And we keep rediscovering this rule all the time. Oh, you know, we get better and quicker decisions if we decentralize. And then, you know, what happens over time is the constant upward creep in centralization, and companies go through these sort of revolutions where they centralize, and then they bring in a new management, they find the solution is to decentralize, and then the next group of managers finds the solutions in centralization. And it's not because they're all idiots, it's because there's benefits to both. And in fact, the ideal system may be to actually cycle through with some amount of decentralization followed by centralization and so forth. But at least in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was through going to greater decentralization that we turned the tide. As he said, we had a culture of excellence in our forces. It was, how good can I be at my task? That's an ordinary capability. Being good at your task. How good can I be at flying an airplane, dropping bombs, locating an enemy's target? But that's not as important as how well those pieces mesh together. Dynamic capabilities, how they get tied together. So the individual assets, if you will, and the individual competences are nothing unless you tie them together with the right strategy and you execute on that. So I could go back even further. I found this great quote. This is the British Navy in the Battle of Jutland, when the British Navy, much larger than the German Navy, lined up against each other in the Battle of Jutland. The British were expected to win, but it was a stalemate. They didn't. And the British, being a very reflective nation, says, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today. So he said, how come we didn't win? You know, we had more and bigger battleships than the Germans. And a naval historian looking at it years later says, the real deficiency was a loss of Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson's touch. It was not the bloody ships that were principally at fault, it was the inadequate doctrine of command and control. So no strategy, no coordination, just having ships firing at each other. That goes back to that initial slide where you got the tanks lined up on one side. Business is the same thing. It's about agility, it's about figuring out strategy, business models, and constantly segueing from one to the other and learning, because the world that you're in is different from the world that the rest of us knew when we went to school. Your world has so much more uncertainty, in part because there's so much more opportunity. But that's not just opportunity for you, it's other people seeing the same opportunities too. So things move faster, and it's your ability to thread all of that together that's a good part of success. So this is my effort now. I must be running out of time, 5 minutes, to try and pull this together in a couple of slides. So here I've got my ordinary capabilities, technical efficiency, all this sort of humdrum stuff. I'm not saying this is unimportant. You've got to be able to do this. Everyone has to do the humdrum stuff in an organization, or at least outsource. The good news is you can outsource a lot of the humdrum stuff. But you got to do it. You got to have access to it. You got to be world class. You got to be best at this and best at that. But you need more. That's about doing things right. Over here, dynamic capabilities, it's about strategic fit, shaping the environment if necessary. You don't take the environment as a given. It's a control variable. You can sometimes, you know, Bill Gates was always good at it, you know, by putting software in the schools, you try and affect the way that people learn, and so you improve the market for your products. Apple did the same thing. It's about sensing, seizing, and shaping and transforming, and I'm going to pull it right back to Claremont here, doing the right things. And dear old Peter Drucker, he would sometimes say this, you know what, guys, it's not about doing things right, it's doing the right things. Now, it's not original to him. You can actually go back, and I think it's someone else, Kurt Lewin, I think, may have said it first. But Peter would frequently say this. And a wise guy like Peter, you knew he meant it and he knew it was right, but he couldn't tell you why. He couldn't quite tell you why. He could give you lots of good stories. And we need to get beyond the stories to put some substance behind it, and that's what I'm trying to do with this concept of dynamic capabilities. And obviously, strategy, doing the right things is a lot to do with what strategy is about. I'll skip this one. So what is strategy? A good strategy is a specific and coherent response to an approach for overcoming the obstacles to progress. Involves three components, and I'm borrowing here from my good colleague, Dick Remote at UCLA, who has one of the clearest statements on strategy. You want to read his little book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, I recommend it. About diagnosing the situation correctly, figuring out a guiding policy, and then bringing coherent action to it. And what I've come to understand is that strategy has to be part of dynamic capabilities. This is my own learning. I won't find this in my 97 article, and no one has suggested that it should be. But the more I've thought about these issues, this is how competitive advantage is built at the level of the firm. Obviously you start with a political, social environment. There are tangible and intangible assets. You pull together a firm the way the classic economics textbooks, or closer to the way the classic economics textbooks describes it. That's all about ordinary stuff. What's in the textbook is about ordinary stuff. Then it's bringing strategy and dynamic capabilities together. You play those two right, you get to build long-term competitive advantage. It begs the question as, well, okay, what is playing it right? And that's where there's now a large literature, several hundred papers that try to do that, as well as a book that I'm putting together with Oxford University Press, and another one with Harvard Business School Press that will put some more meat on the bones. Well, you know what? I think I'm about out of time, and I know you folks are smart and will have more good questions that I could possibly think of. So rather than talking about some other applications, why don't I just stop there and open it up for questions?
Thank you, David. Okay, questions from the students?
Yes.
Thanks so much for speaking today. When you were talking about decentralization of command, the first thing that came to mind for me was the emphasis in Silicon Valley on company culture, particularly at lower levels of the organization.
Called what?
Company culture.
Yes.
And so I wonder if you'd comment on the role that company culture plays in producing competitive advantages, if you think it's an intangible asset of its own, or if it's just a helpful but ultimately unnecessary facilitator of dynamic.
No, I'm a strong corporate culture guy in the sense that, and it's very hard, economists, my first degree is in economics. Only in the last 20 years have economists sort of been willing to say, well, maybe there's something to culture. Here is the way I explain culture to my economic colleagues. Culture is control on the cheap. When economists think about how to get people to do things, they think incentives. And they'll pile more and more money over here, and if things aren't going right, it must be because the incentives are screwed up. Well, you do need to have incentives right. If you got good culture and bad incentives, it won't work. But with culture, if you can get people both committed to a sense of purpose, they'll go the extra mile, and you'll also get coordination and cooperation going inside an organization. So culture and values are basically the culture, the values of the organization, and I think it's very much an underappreciated area. Unfortunately, it's hard to be scientific around culture, and as a result, a lot of my colleagues poo-poo it, but it's absolutely critical. I mean, if you look at the armed forces, clear that culture is critical to the success of the armed forces. It's critical in I would say that almost all high-performance companies are also high-culture companies. I think the organization behavior literature has established that. But figuring out how to combine it in is difficult. Yes? If you take your
A lot of top firms cite keeping their ordinary capabilities in-house and not contracting them out as part of the reason they have their competitive advantage. What do you think about the pros and cons of that?
Well, I think that's a mistake. Now, sometimes there's a wrinkle around ordinary that makes them something that's not ordinary. But if you're just doing something that someone else can do, then you ought to be thinking every day of whether that's distracting from you building your dynamic capabilities. I'm not saying it's bad to be, if you're best of breed and best of class with an ordinary capability, sure, it's not hurting you, but in this framework, it's not helping you either. So, it's something that should be looked at. And if you're certainly not as good and you can outsource it, then you should outsource it, unless there are difficult coordination problems associated with outsourcing it. Yeah. Well, they do. They do outsource. I mean, that's what Foxconn in China, and there's 1.5 million jobs associated with outsourcing. But in fact, Cook has said, well, I'm bringing it a little bit back onshore in the United States. And in fact, there's now, because of change in relative costs, all kinds of stuff is coming back from China. When you couple the fact that they're no longer as cost competitive, plus there's an extra coordination cost associated with large supply lines, stuff is coming back onshore in the U.S. So we are going to create jobs because China has been so successful at adopting the ways of the West in modern manufacturing and the like. But having said that, I don't think that you can. I noticed when while Tim Cook got a headline for bringing manufacturing back on, it was a $200 million expenditure, and then they got $80 billion in cash. So it's sort of more a PR, or maybe it's an experiment. I suspect that it's an experiment. Remember, they did have manufacturing onshore in Fremont. They were one of the last to move their computers offshore, but eventually they did. Yeah.
So if you took your model down one extra level to the individuals within the firms,
yes,
do you say that they also have these intangible competencies? And do you think if they do, that they can be learned and taught, or do you think it's something more innate and that it's something that they have to kind of grow up with?
A very good question. Well, there's how do you get from individual to organizational behavior, and routines and processes sort of link the two. I do believe that you can shape the dynamic capabilities can be manifested in individuals, but they're not going to be effective if there's only one person in the organization that has it, unless it's a CEO. They're going to be constantly frustrated because they're going to see the need to orchestrate things, but if you can't get that done, it's going to lead to deep frustration. So you need a few people in the organization with authority that have strong dynamic capabilities themselves, but you've got to figure out how to embed that in the organization's change routines. I'm choosing my words carefully because it can't be a routine because I'm talking about something that's always changing. So you've got to figure out how to figure out new change routines. When I know I've got to change, how am I going to go about doing it? But I think that the answer is that you're better off. An organization that doesn't have it in any individuals isn't going to be able to have it in the organization. But if it's in the organization as well as in the individuals, you clearly, have a much stronger and better organization, in my view. But once again, these are very, I'm talking tentatively because there's not a lot of research on this.
Two more questions. One here.
Thanks again for coming. I was just wondering, what are the implications of your framework regarding ordinary and dynamic capabilities on valuing an employee based on whether they contribute to one or the other capability?
Well, very, very good question. Clearly, someone who can contribute to and can lead an organization, make it dynamically competitive, is worth a very high premium. And we've had sort of, quote, runaway executive pay. One of the questions is how much of that, some of those are for, very valued individuals, that can actually help an organization become dynamically competitive. So I think that there is potentially a high premium if you can find managers who can do this. I actually, in my dynamic capabilities thing, I say the role of, there's only one type of manager that can be successful in today's economy, and it's what I call the entrepreneurial manager. Now, we always used to think there's entrepreneurs over here and there's managers over there. No longer. You know, if you don't have an entrepreneurial manager, if you're just managing, you're doing the ordinary capability stuff, you're about to go down the tubes. And so we have to, you know, entrepreneurship's not just about small companies, which I know the emphasis around here and in our entrepreneurship program at Cal Berkeley, too much of it's on, you know, how do you do startups? But this, you know, this methodology here is not just for small companies. In my view, it's also for big companies, and that's what you've got to be able to achieve. So individuals can get high premiums if they can do this. So they're both entrepreneur and manager, you know. They're both, good managers are scarce, good entrepreneurs are scarce. Someone who can do both, it's a very rare group of folks. I hope you're one of them. I hope that the program here is salting and creating many such folks.
We are trying. We're trying. So, David, thank you very much. I would like to mention that there is an informal time with David this afternoon at 4 o'clock at the Kravis Leadership Institute in the conference room if any of you have time and would like to have more of a dialogue with David. You're welcome to come over at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, and let's all give him a big hand of gratitude.